We're going to be in the book of Daniel in just a moment. But let me tell you a story. It could be a true story. But it happens to be like our story this morning is going to be. 4 guys. They were on their way to school, and they were running late because they had a flat tire. And of course, we all know flat tires don't show you any mercy, do they? And they always don't pick the right time either. They walk into the classroom and they apologize to the teacher for being late. And she kind of looks at them, and she was actually kind of positive as she dealt with it. And she says, there's one thing that's kind of good for you guys. You missed the test this morning. And this sounded like it was a college class, to say the least. But she said, I'm going to let you make up that test. So at the end of the class, she handed each of them a piece of paper and a pencil. She told them to go to each of the 4 corners, since there's 4 of them, and face the wall. And she said, this is your test. Which tire was flat? Was that a trick question or not? That's up to you to decide. But I'll also tell you a true story that happened to me personally when I was at Abilene Christian. I was taking one of those lovely English classes that you have to take to level out. And any of you that are familiar with ACU, y'all ever heard of Sing Song? Or for Harding, it's called Spring Sing. Can't remember what they call it at OCU. What do they call it, Joel? Spring Sing too, okay. Big deal on these Christian campuses. And we had a test in that English class. Professor, he was Dr. Forrest, I believe it was. He had put on there, if you read the directions to this test, put your name at the top of the paper and turn it in. I read the directions. A lot of the students did not. And now that I've been a teacher too, since that time, it makes a difference. Because the ones that didn't turn in the test failed automatically. They were not happy campers because they had been busy all week long preparing for Sing Song. And they made it very verbal. But after teaching for 23 years and having to give the state test, you know why most students fail? They don't read the directions. It's just a fact of life. Everything we do is a test, isn't it? A lot of what we're about is a test of what we're going to be. Well, we're going to look at 4 young men who had to take a test, you might say, themselves. It was a test of character. Oh, I went the wrong way. And just to piggyback off of what Michael's been doing for the past few weeks, he's been talking about the Jesus way, and then I got to thinking about Daniel doing it God's way. Because everything we do is what? God's way, isn't it? Should be the focus of what we're about. But to understand the story, well, let's go through here and read the first part of Daniel chapter 1 to get a feel for how this is going to go. Well, let me do it this way. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put them in his treasure house for his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites of royal family and of nobility, young men who are without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. And he was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king also assigned them a daily amount of food and wine. Go to the next slide. And they were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter into the king's service. Among those who were chosen was Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official then gave them new names. To Daniel he named him Belteshazzar. To Hannah he became Shadrach. To Mishael he became Meshach. And to Azariah Abednego. Do those names ring a bell? Yeah, we know those 3 names. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Verse 8 is kind of the key verse for our lesson. Daniel, it says, had a different heart. I don't know how old Daniel was exactly at this point in time, but I'm guessing he may have been somewhere between 12 to 16 years old. I'm not sure what the Babylonians would have chosen for an age, but obviously in the Jewish culture, about 12 years old, you have your bar mitzvah, and you become a young man, kind of like our quinceañera for our young ladies here in this Latin culture. And so I would guess between 12 and 16, these 4 young men were chosen. They weren't the only ones, but they're the ones that Daniel tells the story. And this is happening about 605 BC. This is when Nebuchadnezzar came the very first time and sacked Jerusalem and took away a bunch of the Israelites to captivity. And if you know the book of Daniel, and you've read it a time or two, you know that Daniel chapter 6, Daniel's thrown into the lion's den under a different king named Darius the Mede. And Darius the Mede came to power about 537 BC. So Daniel's probably in his 80s by the time you get to that story. But this verse tells you his character. This verse tells you why Daniel lived such a long life and why Daniel got out of the lion's den alive. Because of his choices. The first thing we see is that he chose, it says, not to defile himself with the king's food. Now that seems kind of trivial, right? But we see Daniel and his 3 friends, they're in a situation where it could be very easy to conform and just follow the directions of Ashpenaz, the chief official, and just start chowing. And I'm guessing they probably had some pretty good food going on. I mean, can you imagine every night coming to the table and all the ribs you want, and all the barbecue or all the fried chicken, depending on what your favorite is? Be like going to the buffet every night, who knows? Because the king was willing to do that. But Daniel's thoughts were different. He said, at least allow us. And I don't know if he's talking about just him and his 3 friends, or if he meant all the Israelite young men that had been brought in for this. I don't know who all was included in his request. For sure, he was thinking about himself. Please, don't make me do it. Did he do this out of defiance? What do y'all think? Because, you know, when you're a captive, typically you have to kind of do what you're told, right? But this seems to be kind of a little different situation, and Daniel holds to his faith, holds to his background, and since he was taken from Israel, and I don't know if he lived in Jerusalem in particular, apparently he lived in close proximity, obviously, to Jerusalem, because he's part of the royal family or of nobility. So probably he did live in that vicinity. And so he's taken to Babylon at that time and put into the king's service. But was he doing it just because? Was he taking it lightly? No, I think the key word is he was letting his conscience guide him and his convictions. He was convicted because of his birthright. He was born a Jew. And that was a big part of his identity. Yes, his name got changed to a Chaldean name, Belteshazzar, but do you ever see this name again in the book of Daniel? It's the only time you see that name. Because Daniel knew who he was. He was a Jew by birth, and he wanted to maintain that. Obviously, this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Wasn't an afterthought. But he consciously, out of conviction, said to himself, I'm going to maintain purity. I'm going to be God's man at the right time. I'm going to be God's man because I know it's what he would expect of me. Man, that's a tough one, isn't it? Is it easy to do that today? We look at the world around us. We look at the negativity. We look at all the stuff that is anti-Christian around us. In the media, even in politics, you see it. No matter what, you can't escape it. It's tough. But if we are really who we say we are, purity should be the center stage. And I guess maybe Daniel knew back then kind of what Paul writes about in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. When, I keep going the wrong way. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, when he's talking to us as individuals. Now go back to chapter 3, he says the same thing. But he says, do you not know that your bodies are the temples of the Holy Spirit which is in you, from whom you receive from God? You are not your own. You are bought with a price, therefore honor God with your body. You're a temple. We don't have to have, somebody was asking me just recently, why does the Church of Christ think that it seems like the church is what, the building is the church? And we've talked about this fairly recently. And I said, again, I'll remind you of the song. You can't go to church because the church is you. We are the church. The body is us as the people, the collective group. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, when Paul talks about the temple of God, he's talking to the body as whole. In chapter 6 here, he's reminding us as individuals, we have to maintain our purity because of who lives within you. John says, greater is he that is in you than he that is in what? The world. Again, it's tough. And I mention conviction because the conviction is our guide. And no matter what pressure we face to conform, and yes, ever since Madalyn Murray O'Hair got her way with the Supreme Court back in the 60s when she was suing the Austin School District because my son doesn't believe in God, she said. Y'all know the end of that story. Her son grew up to be a Baptist preacher. But she said when he was in elementary school that he didn't believe in God, so she didn't think he should have to pray at school because prayer, you learn where? At church. School is for learning. And who pays for school? The government. And government or the church and the state are two different things. Supreme Court unfortunately agreed with her. And it changed everything, didn't it? It has changed our society significantly. But conviction. If we are pure in our heart, we have that purity like Daniel, who had already said, I'm not going to defile myself. Then we need to have the same conviction in what we do. And that's the second thing that Daniel demonstrates, that he came with conviction in his heart. He was set on the truth. And he had already figured out God is strong enough to handle it. I'm insignificant, probably was his own thoughts, in the big picture. But if I stand convicted of who I am as a Jewish child, then I need to stand for the God I believe in. Because here he is in an environment where, and going back to the idea of purity, it says that Nebuchadnezzar took some things from the temple. Of course, anything that was made of gold, he probably took with him. And he puts them into the treasury for his God. And if you look at your Bible, big G or little g? It's a little g. It's not God, it is a God. And those things that were taken from the temple had been ceremonial cleansed. They were supposed to be pure vessels used for worship in the temple. And so when Nebuchadnezzar takes them and puts them in his treasury, to his God, they've now been defiled. Do you think that might have been in the back of Daniel's mind too? Because possibly some of the plates and cups might have been that. Don't know. Just a thought. And again, you're looking at a young man who's a captive in a foreign land, who's probably expected to conform, but out of conviction. He says, I'm not going to do it. When we face challenges, what do? And a good example of this working, you go to the very next chapter. His three friends. Nebuchadnezzar builds this humongous statue, and he wants everybody to bow down and worship the statue. What does his three friends do? Not gonna do it. They refused. What happened to them? They lit the fire. I mean, they turned up the heat. But did they die? Because God was on their side. And so there's the evidence that at least these three friends shared that same conviction as Daniel. They were going to maintain their purity despite their surroundings. When the going gets tough, we stand by the truth. For those of us in Bible class this morning, we think like Christ, like Paul says to think in Philippians 4. Another thing too, it's a matter of obedience. Since Daniel was such a good Jewish young man, he remembered Leviticus chapter 11. I'm not going to read that chapter for you. If you want to go back later and look at Leviticus chapter 11, but there's a picture here that will give you an idea of what Leviticus 11 is about. It talks about the clean and the unclean animals. I want you to look at that for a minute. Are we violating that law ourselves? If you've got bacon on that burger. But are we under the Old Testament? No, we live in a new law. It's interesting. But it is something to think about. Because our diet makes a difference. Makes a world of difference in our longevity and how we develop mentally, spiritually, physically. All of those things come into play. And so Daniel is, yes, he wants to obey King Nebuchadnezzar, but he also wants to obey God. And so he has to make that conscious choice. He has to be convicted to stand by what he knows is the right thing to do. It's not that he wants to necessarily defy authority. He just wants to do what he was taught. That there are certain things you do not eat. And I'll have to think about that if I go home and make my ham sandwich. Since Angel's not feeling well, I can conceive that possibly being my lunch. But what do we do when we look at our situation in life? Are we going to be God's people? Or are we going to let the world bend us? There's another song I know about. Talks about these three friends in Daniel 2. They wouldn't bend, they wouldn't bow, and they wouldn't break. Where are we at? Where are you at in your life walk? Are you willing to stand for God when the world says, not going to do it? I can't help but say that. I remember George Bush. I tried to get him to eat broccoli, and he says, not going to do it. George H.W. Bush, I guess I should clarify that. Daddy Bush, I call him. He didn't like broccoli too much. I do like broccoli, but I'm kind of like a comedian I heard one time. He said, it's even better when you pour lots of cheese on it. But again, is that healthy? I'm guessing Daniel would have chosen the raw veggies first. Because a lot of the Jewish diet had to do not only with the certain meats that you see here, but also the right veggies. Makes a difference in our digestive system. It seems to be a proven fact. The food you eat, it makes or breaks your digestive system as well. Well, what's the point of all this? I guess y'all want me to get to the point, right? Because these guys stood the test. It didn't say, if you read the directions, turn it in. It didn't ask you what tire was flat. But it did beg the question, what are you going to do? Are you going to follow God's way, or are you going to follow man's way? And in the end, let me read the rest of the story. So, God caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I am afraid that my lord the king, who has assigned you this food and drink, why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this, and he tested them for 10 days. At the end of those 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine that they were to drink, and he gave them vegetables as well. So that kind of answers our question, doesn't it? The rest of those boys may not have had the same convictions as Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So that's kind of something to think about. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. Now we're talking about the 3 years. Now we're 3 years later. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so they entered into the king's service. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the whole kingdom. What a story. I was a teenager once. Man, that's been a while. Well, 50 years ago today, I got insurance when I started driving a motorcycle, because I didn't want to ride the school bus anymore. So I got me a motorcycle, and if you know anything in Texas, you can get a motorcycle license at 15. So I did. There were a few days when I was driving to high school, it kind of got cold there in Dallas, but I wasn't riding the bus. So I know how long it's been. And in high school, is there a lot of influences to the negative? Man alive. What about as a young adult? College, when you're starting your career? Is there a lot of negative influences that test you? It's tough, isn't it? To be convicted and to obey God's way. And I got to thinking about that, and I thought, you know what? What if when God heard that voice coming from wherever, Noah, I want you to build an ark. What's that? Can you imagine? If you've never heard Bill Cosby tell this story, you might want to listen to it. Noah spent 100 years building the ark. Y'all remember that part of the story? What if he had said, nah, not going to do it? It'd be different, wouldn't it? God cleansed the earth. He started with Noah and his family again. Abraham. God calls him out of his land, which was near Babylon. Actually, Abraham was by birth. He was a Chaldean. How many of you knew that? But then his life was changed. God says, you're going to go to a new land that I'm going to show you. Just trust me. And if you'll do this, I'm going to give you a boy. Because he didn't have any kids. He was 75. He's like, it ain't going to happen. Not in nature. It ain't going to happen. Sarah's too old. God says, if you trust me, it's going to happen. And it did. 25 years later, when Abraham's 100 years old. His wife's 90. And she has a boy named Isaac. Of course, the funny thing is, Isaac means laughter. Because when Sarah was told she was going to be conceiving a son pretty quick, you remember what she did? She laughed. And then that boy turns 12. And in the Jewish culture, which they weren't fully into that yet, it's time for the bar mitzvah. But God says, I want you to go offer your son as a sacrifice. Say, what? You want me to kill my son after you give him to me as a blessing? You've got to be kidding. Isn't that how we'd work today? But he did it. And became the father of a great nation. Because Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob and Esau. But who's the bloodline? If you know the story, it's Jacob, because his name is changed to Israel after a nice little wrestling match. And Israel becomes the name of the nation through the 12 tribes. What if? What if? What if Moses saw that bush up there on the hill and says, I ain't going there. It's too hot. You get play with fire, you're going to get burned. But he did play with the fire. He took off his sandals because he was on holy ground and he heard that voice. He even asked the question, who am I that you would even consider me? Can't talk right, I'm slow of tongue. Well, God says, I'm going to fix that. But just what if Moses has ignored the burning bush? We'd have no 10 commandments. You wouldn't really have the first 5 books of the Old Testament. What if Samuel says, I'm not going to Jesse's house. I'm tired. And then he looks at all the boys in the house. He says, Lord, one of these has got to be. He's trying to find a new king because Saul had blown it. But no, Samuel was doing God's way. So he asked Jesse, do you have any more boys? Because obviously God hadn't answered it yet. And here comes David, the shepherd boy. Maybe he had his harp on his back, I don't know. But he's been out taking care of the sheep. God says, this is my man. So what if Samuel had ignored it? David, the most beloved king of Israel, right? And when we're talking about bloodline. Oh, I'm going the wrong way again. This is the bloodline. David was a descendant of the Messiah, the king, but became the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. What if Jesus in the garden, when he was saying, Lord, let this cup pass from me, he walked out of the garden and the cup passed. He didn't do it. Because he could have easily, when they put those nails in his hands, he could have been like Shelton Cooper. Bazinga. No. And the nails were gone. He could have done that, couldn't he? He was the Son of God. He had the ability. But he didn't do it. He didn't do it. Went too far this time. His burden became our blessing. Because after he dies on the cross, they put him in that tomb. And he rose 3 days later. And that is our story. It takes conviction and it takes obedience to serve the King of Kings. He became the author of creation. If you read John chapter 1, he says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. A couple of verses later, he was there in the beginning with creation. I personally believe Jesus may have been the one that breathed into Adam the breath of life. That's just my personal belief. He was there. He was the creator in every sense. He's God. He's the author of creation and went on to become the author of our recreation as children of God. What if he had never done it? So here's the choice. We either choose the world's way or we choose God's way. What choice are you going to make? And we go back to what Michael's been talking about with the Jesus way. Yeah, there's things that we're lucky we live where we live. Amen? I tell you, there are people that today are dying because they do call themselves Christians, especially in those countries in the Middle East that are very hostile toward Christianity. Ought not to be that way, but it is. So we have a choice. Are we going to choose the world's way or are we going to choose God's way? If you have a need this morning, if you're not a Christian yet, you haven't chosen God's way or the Jesus way through Christ, we invite you to come to be baptized, to wash away your sins, and to start walking in God's way. If you feel like you haven't been walking in God's way, I invite you to come and we'll pray with you, pray for you so we can get it right and get it going with God. If you have a need, won't you come while we stand and sing?